Eleanor Bennett checked her watch as she waited to board her flight. The airport was busy with morning travelers. Eleanor was a well-known black historian who had spent 20 years studying forgotten schools built by black communities after the war. Today was important. She was flying to London to give a talk that could help her win a large grant for schools that needed money. Eleanor touched the old leather notebook in her bag. The notebook was special. It held stories from families who had built schools when their children were not welcome in other places. It had pictures, maps, and notes from hundreds of interviews. Some pages had faded with time, but the stories inside were still powerful. "I can't believe this day is finally here," Eleanor thought as she joined the line to board the plane. A voice came over the speakers. "We are now boarding Flight 237 to London." Eleanor showed her ticket to the smiling flight attendant named Mary. "Seat 14A by the window," Mary said. "Have a good flight." The plane was almost full. Eleanor put her small bag in the overhead bin, but kept her notebook with her. She never let it out of her sight. It was too valuable. As she sat down, a tall man with grey hair took the seat next to her. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Thomas, heading to London for business?" "Something like that," Eleanor smiled. "I'm giving an important presentation tomorrow." Eleanor didn't want to talk much. She needed to review her notes one last time. Her presentation had to be perfect. The National Education Foundation was offering a grant worth £1.6 billion. With that money, Eleanor could help hundreds of schools in poor areas. She could honour the forgotten people who had built schools with their own hands when no one else would help. The captain's voice came through the speakers. "Good morning, everyone. We're expecting a smooth flight to London today. Flight time will be about 1 hour and 20 minutes. Eleanor opened her notebook as the plane took off. She carefully turned the delicate pages. Some had old photographs of smiling children standing in front of simple buildings. Other pages had letters from teachers who had worked for almost no money because they believed in education. "My grandmother was one of those teachers," Eleanor whispered to herself. "This is for you, Grandma Rose." Rose Bennett had taught in a small school in Birmingham for 40 years. She had told Eleanor stories about children walking miles to school because education was their only hope for a better life. Rose had saved every penny to buy books. When the school roof leaked, she had helped fix it herself. Education lifted. "Sans when nothing else could," Rose always said. Eleanor had started collecting these stories when she was just a university student. Now, at 52, she was finally going to share them with people who could make a difference. Thomas looked over, with interest. "That's a beautiful old notebook." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "It holds my life's work." "Must be important," Thomas said. "More than you know," Eleanor replied. She turned to a page with a hand-drawn map showing where the first community schools had been built. Many had been forgotten, their buildings torn down, their stories lost. But Eleanor had found them again. The flight attendants began serving drinks. Eleanor asked for tea and carefully moved her notebook to avoid any spills. As she did, a loose page slipped out, a letter from a woman named Dorothy, who had attended one of the first black community schools in 1953. Eleanor quickly tucked it back into place. Every piece of paper was precious. She couldn't risk losing. "Anything before tomorrow?" "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence ahead," the captain announced. "Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened." Eleanor closed her notebook and held it tightly on her lap. Her hands were shaking slightly. Was it the turbulence or nerves about tomorrow? "You seem worried," Thomas said. "This presentation could change everything," Eleanor explained. "These schools need help. The children need better books, better buildings, better chances." "I'm sure you'll do wonderfully," Thomas encouraged her. Eleanor nodded and took a deep breath. 20 years of research had led to this moment. Tomorrow she would stand in front of the Education Foundation and tell them about the forgotten heroes who had built schools when their children were turned away from others. She would show them faded photographs and letters. She would make them understand why this history mattered. The plane shook slightly as it hit turbulence. Eleanor held her notebook tighter. She didn't know that in a few minutes that precious notebook would slip from her hands and into the aisle. She didn't know that this simple accident would lead to public humiliation and later to unexpected triumph. For now, Eleanor Bennet simply reviewed her notes, hopeful and unaware of what was about to happen. The plane shook without warning. Eleanor tried to hold onto her notebook, but a strong bump made it slip from her hands. It fell to the floor and slid into the aisle. Several loose papers fluttered out, spreading across the airplane floor. "Oh dear," Eleanor gasped. She quickly unbuckled her seatbelt, ready to get up and gather her precious work. 20 years of research was scattered on the floor. Her heart raced with worry. A flight attendant with blonde hair and a name tag that read Lucy was walking by. She saw the notebook and papers. "Don't worry, I've got it," Lucy said with a smile, bending down to pick up the notebook and loose pages. Eleanor sat back, relieved. "Thank you so much." But instead of simply returning the notebook, Lucy began to look through it. She flipped through the pages with a confused look on her face. The old handwritten notes and carefully drawn maps seemed to puzzle her. "Interesting," Lucy said, but her tone suggested she didn't find it interesting at all. She waved to 2 other flight attendants who were nearby. "Robert, Emma, come look at this," Lucy called. A tall man with dark hair and a shorter woman with a ponytail came over. They gathered around Lucy as she showed them Eleanor's notebook. "Look at this," Lucy said with a small laugh. She pointed at Eleanor's careful diagrams of old school buildings and her neat handwritten notes from interviews. "Is this supposed to be research?" Eleanor's stomach tightened. She could hear them clearly, though they didn't seem to realize she was listening. Robert took the notebook and flipped through more pages. "Looks like scribbles to me," he chuckled. "Proper academics use computers nowadays. Who writes things by hand anymore?" Emma joined in, pointing at a page with a child's drawing that had been given to Eleanor by an elderly woman who had attended one of the first black community schools. "Maybe it's for children, some kind of storybook." Eleanor felt her face grow hot. The 3 flight attendants were laughing at her life's work. They didn't understand what they were holding. They didn't know that each page contained stories that had almost been lost forever. They didn't realize they were mocking history itself. Other passengers had turned to watch. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed curious about what was happening. A young man with glasses in the row across from Eleanor had his phone out. Eleanor noticed he was recording the scene. His face looked serious, not amused like the flight attendants. Eleanor took a deep breath. She could feel tears threatening to form, but she would not cry. She had faced worse than this in her career. She had been ignored by publishers, turned away by universities, and told her research wasn't important. This was just one more challenge. With as much calm as she could gather, Eleanor spoke up. "Excuse me," she said quietly but clearly. Her voice didn't shake, though her hands did. "That's my life's work. Please return it." The flight attendants looked up, surprised to hear her voice. They hadn't realized she could hear their comments. Their smiles quickly disappeared when they saw her face. Lucy's cheeks turned pink with embarrassment. Robert looked down at his shoes. Emma stepped back. "I'm sorry," Lucy said, but the words sounded empty. She carefully gathered the loose papers and put them back in the notebook. Then she handed everything to Eleanor without meeting her eyes. "I didn't mean—" Eleanor took her notebook and held it close. "Thank you," she said simply, though she felt anything but thankful. The flight attendants quickly walked away, whispering to each other. Other passengers turned back to their books or screens, but the moment of shame hung in the air. Thomas, the businessman sitting next to Eleanor, leaned closer. "That was terribly wrong of them," he whispered. His eyes showed real concern. "Are you all right?" Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't all right at all. She felt exposed and humiliated. Her hands trembled slightly as she carefully checked her notebook to make sure all the pages were still there. "People often mock what they don't understand," she said quietly. "What is your research about?" Thomas asked gently. Eleanor ran her fingers over the cover of her notebook. "I study forgotten schools," she explained. "After the war, many black children couldn't go to regular schools, so communities built their own. They used whatever they had. Sometimes they taught in living rooms or church basements. The teachers often worked for almost no money." Thomas listened with interest. "And your notebook contains their stories?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I've spent 20 years finding the people who remember these schools. Many are very old now. When they die, their stories could be lost forever if no one records them. Across the aisle, the young man with the phone, his name was Oliver, though Eleanor didn't know this yet, was still recording. He had captured everything. The flight attendants laughing, Eleanor's dignified response, and now her quiet explanation to Thomas. Oliver didn't know that his video would soon change Eleanor's life. He didn't know it would be seen by millions of people. He just knew that something wrong had happened and someone should see it. Eleanor carefully tucked her notebook into her bag, making sure it was secure. The rest of the flight stretched ahead, and it would be uncomfortable now. But tomorrow she would still give her presentation. Nothing would stop her from sharing these important stories with the world. Oliver got off the plane and sat in the airport waiting for his next flight. He looked at the video on his phone. He felt angry about how the flight attendants had treated the older woman with the notebook. He decided to post the video online. "Just saw something really wrong on my flight," he wrote. This respected historian had her work mocked by airline staff. "This is how they treat people who preserve our history." Oliver pressed the share button and put his phone away. He didn't think much would happen. He was wrong. By morning, Oliver's video had been shared thousands of times. People were angry. They wrote comments like "shameful treatment" and "she deserves an apology." A hashtag started trending. "Respect our historians." Eleanor woke up in her hotel room and checked her phone. She was surprised to see so many messages. Friends, students, and even people she had never met were writing to her. They all said they supported her and were angry about how she had been treated. Her phone rang. It was Professor Thomas Baker from Oxford University. "Eleanor, I just saw that terrible video," he said. "It's disgraceful how they treated you. I want you to know that the entire historical community stands with you. Your work is important." Eleanor thanked him. She was touched by the support, but also worried. Today was her big presentation. She needed to focus on that, not on what had happened on the plane. She turned on the television in her hotel room. To her shock, she saw her own face on the news. A video showing airline staff mocking a respected historian has caused outrage, the news reporter said. Dr. Eleanor Bennett was traveling to London to present her research on forgotten schools when flight attendants laughed at her handwritten notes and called them scribbles. Eleanor quickly turned off the TV. This was not how she had wanted to be in the news. She took a deep breath and opened her email. There was a message from the airline's CEO, Jane Richards. "Dr. Bennett, we deeply regret the incident that occurred on our flight yesterday. The behavior of our staff does not reflect our company values. We are investigating the matter and will take appropriate action. Please accept our sincere apologies." Eleanor didn't reply. She had more important things to do today. She carefully dressed in her best suit, packed her notebook in her bag, and left for the Education Foundation building. When her taxi arrived at the foundation, Eleanor was shocked again. News vans lined the street. Reporters with cameras stood outside the building. People held signs that said, "Respect our historians and knowledge deserves respect." A security guard helped Eleanor through the crowd. Inside the building, Henry Mills, the director of the Education Foundation, was waiting for her. "Dr. Bennett," he said, looking concerned, "we've seen the news. Are you all right to continue with your presentation today? We can reschedule if you need time." Eleanor straightened her jacket and stood tall. "I'm more determined than ever, sir," she said firmly. "These stories have waited too long to be heard. I won't make them wait any longer." Henry nodded with respect. "Then let's proceed. The committee is ready for you." He led Eleanor to a large boardroom. 10 people sat around a long table. They all looked at her with interest as she entered. Some seemed curious about the woman from the video. Others seemed impressed by her calm dignity. Eleanor set up her materials at the front of the room. She took out her notebook, the same one that had been mocked on the plane, and placed it carefully on the table. "Good morning," she began. "Thank you for this opportunity. Before I start my presentation, I want to tell you what this notebook means to me." She held up the worn leather book. These pages contain voices that have been silenced for generations. Today they will finally be heard. The room was completely quiet. Everyone was listening closely. For the next 2 hours, Eleanor shared her research with passion and clarity. She showed photographs of small buildings where children had learned to read when other schools wouldn't accept them. She read letters from teachers who had worked without proper pay because they believed in education. She told stories of parents who had given their time and money to build schools when no one else would help their children. Mrs. Dorothy Lewis was 92 when I interviewed her, Eleanor said, showing a picture of an elderly woman with a bright smile. She told me her father helped build their school with wood from his own house. "We need the school more than we need that extra room," he had told her. As Eleanor spoke, she noticed several committee members wiping tears from their eyes. Her words were touching their hearts. The stories of struggle and hope were powerful. When Eleanor finished her presentation, the room was silent for a moment. Then Henry Mills stood up and began to clap. Everyone joined him. The applause filled the EJ room. "Dr. Bennett," Henry said when the clapping finally stopped, "thank you for preserving these important stories. Your work is exactly what this grant was created to support." Eleanor smiled. She had done it. Despite everything that had happened, she had shared her research well. As she gathered her materials, Henry touched her arm gently. "There's quite a crowd outside," he said. "The video of what happened on your flight has made people angry at the airline. There are protesters with signs supporting you." Eleanor looked out the window. Indeed, the crowd had grown larger. People held signs saying "History matters" and "Fire those flight attendants." "I didn't want all this attention," Eleanor said softly. "Sometimes," Henry replied, "it takes an unfortunate event to bring attention to important work. Your research might reach more people now." Eleanor nodded. Perhaps some good would come from yesterday's humiliation after all. The most important thing was that her presentation had gone well. The forgotten stories had been heard. That was what truly mattered. Eleanor waited 3 long days for news about the grant. She tried to keep busy in her hotel room, but she couldn't help checking her phone every few minutes. The video of the flight attendants mocking her notebook was still being shared online. More people were talking about her research now than ever before. On the 3rd day, her phone rang. It was Henry Mills from the Education Foundation. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his voice happy. "I have good news. The committee has made their decision." Eleanor held her breath. "We are giving the full grant of £1.6 billion to your research team," Henry announced. Eleanor felt tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "This will help so many schools." "There is one more thing," Henry continued. "As you know, we had planned to partner with National Airways for transportation in this project. But after what happened to you on their flight, we have decided to exclude them from any involvement in the program." Eleanor wasn't sure how to feel about this. She hadn't wanted to cause trouble for the airline. She had only wanted to share her research. "The way their staff treated you and your work was unacceptable," Henry explained. "We want partners who respect education and history." After the call ended, Eleanor sat quietly for a while. The grant would allow her team to help hundreds of underfunded schools. They could create new history books that included the forgotten stories. They could repair old school buildings. They could give scholarships to students. It was everything she had worked for. That evening, Eleanor watched the news. The reporter was talking about National Airways. "The airline stock has dropped sharply today," the reporter said. "This comes after the Education Foundation announced they will not partner with National Airways for their new £1.6 billion education program. The decision follows an incident where airline staff mocked a historian's research notebook." The next morning, Eleanor received an email from Jane Richards, the CEO of National Airways. "Dr. Bennett, I would like to meet with you in person to discuss what happened on our flight. Please let me know if you would be willing to talk." Eleanor thought about ignoring the email. She was tired and ready to go home, but something made her reply with a simple yes. They met that afternoon in a quiet room at Eleanor's hotel. Jane Richards was a tall woman in a neat business suit. She looked worried. "Dr. Bennett," Jane began, "we failed you terribly." Eleanor nodded. "Not just me," she said quietly. "You failed to recognize the value of our shared history." Jane looked down at her hands. "You're right. What happened shows a bigger problem. Our staff didn't understand what they were holding." She slid a folder across the table. "We want to make this right. The flight attendants have asked to meet." They want to apologize in person. Would you be willing to talk to them? Eleanor thought about saying no, she didn't need to hear their apologies. But then she thought about her work, about preserving and sharing history. Maybe this was another chance to share those stories. Yes, she said, I'll meet them. Later that day, Lucy, Robert and Emma entered the hotel meeting room. They all looked nervous. Their eyes were down and their shoulders were tense. They had been all over the news, their faces from Oliver's video shown again and again. People were angry at them. Lucy spoke first. Her voice was shaky. Dr. Bennett, we acted thoughtlessly and hurt you deeply. There's no excuse for what we did. Robert nodded. We were disrespectful to you and your work. I'm truly sorry. We didn't think about how our actions would make you feel, Emma added. It was wrong. Eleanor studied their faces. They seemed truly sorry. But did they understand what they had done? Do you understand what was in that notebook? She asked. They shook their heads. Then let me teach you, Eleanor said. She opened her notebook, the same one they had laughed at days before. For the next hour, Eleanor shared the stories she had collected. She showed them pictures of children who had sat in classrooms without heat. She told them about teachers who had used their own money to buy books. She described how communities had built schools stone by stone when their children had nowhere else to learn. This is Mrs. Johnson, Eleanor said, showing a photo of an elderly woman. She walked 5 miles to school each day because her family couldn't afford the bus. Later, she became a teacher herself and taught for 40 years. As Eleanor spoke, she saw the flight attendants' faces change. They began to understand what they had mocked. These weren't just old papers. This was living history. This letter, Eleanor said, holding up a delicate page, was written by a father to his daughter on her first day of school. Learn everything you can, he wrote. Education is something no one can ever take from you. By the time Eleanor finished sharing her stories, Lucy was wiping tears from her eyes. Robert was staring at the ground, his face red with shame. Emma was nodding slowly, finally understanding. I had no idea, Lucy whispered. These stories are important. They are, Eleanor agreed, and now you know why. For a moment, the room was completely quiet. Then Jane spoke from where she had been sitting in the corner. Dr. Bennett, she said, would you be willing to help us? We need to learn from this mistake. Perhaps you could help us create a training program for our staff to teach them about respecting different kinds of knowledge and research. Eleanor closed her notebook thoughtfully. Perhaps some good could come from this difficult experience after all. Yes, she said, I think I would be willing to do that. 1 year passed. Many things changed in that time. Eleanor stood in front of a crowd in a new building. A sign above the door read, Bennett Institute for Educational Equity. The building was bright and modern, with large windows letting in sunshine. Eleanor looked at the faces watching her. There were teachers, students, and important people from the education world. In the front rows sat children from 50 schools that had received money from the grant. These schools had new books, better buildings, and more teachers now. Behind Eleanor on the stage sat Lucy. She was no longer just a flight attendant. Now she was the chief of cultural training at National Airways. She wore a smart suit and looked proud to be there. 1 year ago, something difficult happened, Eleanor began. My work was mocked, my research was laughed at. It was a painful moment. She paused and smiled. But from that mockery came meaning. From that humiliation came hope. The crowd nodded. Many of them knew the story. They had seen the video that changed everything. Eleanor spotted Thomas in the audience. He had been the businessman sitting next to her on that flight. After learning about her work, he had become the Institute's biggest private donor. His company now gave money to help more schools. Near Thomas sat Oliver, the young man who had recorded the video on the plane. He was now studying journalism at university with a special scholarship from the Institute. His quick thinking had helped change many lives. Today, we don't just celebrate new buildings and books, Eleanor continued. We celebrate a new understanding. History isn't something distant or dusty. It lives in our hands, in our notebooks, in our everyday actions. She looked at Lucy, who smiled back. After their meeting a year ago, Lucy had worked hard to create a new training program for airline staff. The program was called Recognizing Value, and it taught people to respect different kinds of knowledge and research. Robert and Emma helped run the program too. They had all learned from their mistake. "Our work has just begun," Eleanor said, "but we have already helped 50 schools. More than 5,000 children now have better places to learn. They have books that tell the full story of our history, including the voices that were once forgotten." Eleanor turned and pointed to a glass case on the stage. Inside was her old leather notebook, the same one that had been mocked on the plane. It was open to a page with a child's drawing and an old photograph. "This notebook is now the first piece in our museum," Eleanor explained. "Not because of what happened to it, but because of what it represents. It shows us that every story matters. Every piece of our history deserves respect." The children from the schools watched with wide eyes. They had heard about the notebook and the video. Some of them had even studied Eleanor's research in their new history classes. "This notebook wasn't just about the past," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger. "It was always about the future, a future where every voice is heard, every story honored, and every child given the chance to write their own history." She looked out at the children's faces. "You are that future," she told them. "Your stories matter too. We built this institute so you can learn about those who came before you, and so you can create your own stories worth telling." The crowd began to clap. People stood up one by one until everyone was on their feet, applauding loudly. On the big screen behind Eleanor, a picture appeared. It was an old black-and-white photograph of her grandmother, Rose Bennett, standing in front of one of the first community schools. Under the picture were Rose's words that Eleanor had never forgotten: "Education lifted us when nothing else could." After the ceremony, Eleanor walked through the new building. Children ran past her, excited to see the classrooms and the library. The walls were covered with photographs and stories from her research, stories that might have been lost if she hadn't worked so hard to save them. Lucy joined her in the hallway. "It's amazing," Lucy said, looking around. "All of this from one notebook." Eleanor smiled. "And one mistake that turned into a chance to learn." They walked together toward the museum room, where more pieces of history were displayed. The room was full of people reading and learning. "Do you ever regret what happened on the plane?" Eleanor asked. Lucy thought for a moment. "I regret hurting you," she said honestly. "But I don't regret what came after. Look at all of this. Look at how many people now know these stories." Eleanor nodded. From the corner of her eye, she saw Oliver showing his journalism professor the display about how his video had helped create change. Nearby, Thomas was talking with school principals about funding more programs. What had started with humiliation had grown into something powerful. A moment of mockery had become a movement of meaning. The stories that had almost been forgotten were now being shared with a new generation. Eleanor touched the glass case that held her notebook. The leather was worn, the pages were yellowed, but the stories inside were now alive in the world, like never before. "Education lifted us when nothing else could," she whispered, echoing her grandmother's words. "And now it would lift many more."